I know Nancy and Tom, I know that you guys had sent some documents in. Thank you very much for that. We really appreciate it. And Tom, I understand you created a presentation for special for today.
Right, I put something together because I just sent it to Janelle. It's really just a highlight of the other material, and we could put it on the website too. I think people who look at it later, they could, catch up what we were talking about more.
Yeah, I'll definitely post it.
Oh, and that's what we're looking at now.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So Tom, do you want to give the overview, and then I also have like the outline that we can kind of go over just to get everybody caught up.
Sure, I'll be glad to.
Thanks, Tom.
So since our last meeting, I went back and Janelle and Charlie and I talked about dividing up the work. There's quite a bit of things to do. The things I was doing was taking a shot at the pre-application meeting, which isn't in the code right now. And then I looked at section 170.17 for the planning commission review specifically, and the preliminary review instead of preliminary consent. A lot of the time was spent on the standards and conditions, and I'll get to that later. But so what I wanted to walk you through was just some of the sample code changes that I put together as I went into these three things. And the first one was looking from the standpoint of our code, the pre-application meeting. So what you're looking at is some sample language. And I think, Nancy, you mentioned this too in your comments, that a pre-application meeting may be needed for a minor subdivision as well. So it's really, what we're looking at in everything else we've talked about so far was major subdivision, but we do think that a pre-application discussion's needed. Sometimes it's not clear what's a minor or a major subdivision, actually, until you see a plan, because it really gets into, if you look at the definition, which is in minor subdivision, there's a lot of ifs and ends and things like that. So I put together this part here. There is already an existing section 170.10. It's in the current code, it's designation of minor and major subdivision. It really doesn't say too much, except that you should look at that, and some determination would need to be made. And it wasn't always clear. I think it says the building official does it in the current code. But what I did is I said, in this proposal, is to introduce the idea of a pre-application meeting. And that's what this sample language is here. It talks about it. It talks about the process. So it's really the first thing an applicant's typically going to look at as their first step. And what it's going to say to them is they should contact the city planner, Janelle, to schedule and discuss the pre-application meeting. And it talks about the purposes, which are highlighted, to discuss the process, review the subdivision type, if it's minor or major. And again, it may not be determined until that meeting, and there may need to be further discussion too. And then to review the initial subdivisions or submittal steps, which aren't always clear, but Janelle can help people clarify that so they're not losing time down the road or going through delays or having delays. So this is it's not in major subdivision section. If you were to go this way, it's earlier in the code, which talks just about subdivisions. It could apply to minor subdivisions as well. And again, that's something for discussion, and Janelle might have thoughts on that too. I'm not sure it would be needed for a minor lot line application, but it's just calling it out here is probably that would be exempt. So not much to this except to introduce the topic. We'd probably have more in terms of definitions, things like that. But I just wanted to share this with you about how to incorporate it into the code.
Hey, Tom, got a couple questions about it.
Go ahead, Charlie.
I noticed you referred to following initial review of a proposal just above the yellow highlighted sections. And that seems like a step that the proposal part of it, maybe that's within the request to have the pre-application meeting from the developer or something like that. But I didn't know what that meant by initial review of a proposal.
Let me see where the purpose of it, right above the highlight, Charlie?
Yeah.
Oh, so I think if an applicant for a minor subdivision, and that's what I was getting at here, if a minor subdivision is going to be exempted, the planner would need to look at it. So maybe they get emailed a copy of it or something like that, because they would need to make a determination whether it's exempt or not.
Oh, I got you. Okay, I see where you're coming from. Okay.
So maybe we need to clarify it more. I was just trying to say that if they are going for an exemption to a minor subdivision application, they'd need to give Janelle something to look at, and possibly you too, because sometimes it's extension of water and sewer that brings it over the line.
Okay, I got you.
But
And
any
the other-
input to make it clear would be good from you guys.
Okay. Yep. The only other thing I think I got from your email and the revisions you made, that this would be, it would only be, this section would be referred to in both the minor and major sections of the code. Is that correct?
That's my thoughts, yeah.
Yeah,
I
'cause
think I did put it in
felt
the
like
major.
when
Go
we
ahead.
were talking about it last time we met, we were real happy with the idea of a preliminary application meeting to not only iron out whether it's minor or major, but really spell out the nuances, especially with a major subdivision, what all those things that are required. I guess we could still do it, even if it's, this way at the preliminary part of the process, rather than, I guess, after we say, hey, it's a major subdivision, do we want to do another pre-application meeting?
No, I think you can cover it at the same
Okay.
time, just the way
Okay.
I've been able to do it in the past.
Okay.
So this pre-application meeting will apply to major and minor subdivision, but not lot lines, correct? Or are you saying this isn't, pre-application does not apply to minor, only when it goes to major?
I'm not, Charlie, Janelle, others, what's your thoughts? Do you think some meeting may be required for a minor subdivision? I didn't want to exempt it outright, but they do get complicated sometimes, especially from water and sewer services or any improvements that are needed. That's my only thought about it.
I thought that the intention here was to say, and I guess I'm saying, I thought that's what we were trying to say, because I think it's what we probably should be trying to say, is that it's required for any major subdivision. But for a minor subdivision, you may end up having one under any of several circumstances. One is if the person actually requests one, I don't think we would deny them the possibility of having it. The second is when you review their initial proposal, if they think it's minor and you think it's major, there's a reason to have a meeting. And then the third would be if, when they review the proposal, even though under the terms of the regs, it would be minor, you think there are, in reviewing it, you believe there are complexities to it where the whole process would benefit from having this meeting, that the city could then request could then say, we need to have the meeting. So it's compulsory for major, and the minor, it can be requested by the city or would be requested by the applicant. I'm sorry, it could be required by the city at their option or requested by the applicant.
And a lot of the times people will just give us a call and it's like, hey, I want to do this. Well, it's like the first thing you need to do is go find a surveyor, because it's like, well, we just want to do this. So I try to help them kind of figure out what they're trying to do ahead of time. So sometimes it can be done via phone call. And sometimes it's like, especially if you're just trying to take one lot and split it into two, a little more complex if you're doing more than that.
Yeah, I can recall recently, I think there was one out at Pilot Town Village, right out by Pilot Town Road, that had some odd, it was like
Yes.
some strange easement or something that was left over from before. And even that one where it really wasn't a subdivision. It was the addition of a property, but it still didn't make it a large enough lot over on 4th Street. That was an odd one. You know, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that I would love to actually get into code. If you're making something more non-conforming, but it still can't meet conformity, that it's okay to move forward.
That's
Yeah.
ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, really, people. All right, so what's the, so it's compulsory for major and then if requested for minor? Is that what we're going with for this?
Sounds good.
Okay. All right.
So this next sample language is, it's not in the code right now. This is 17019, which is currently preliminary consent. This paragraph that I'm inserting, the intent is to provide a purpose statement for preliminary review. And we talked about this quite a bit in our last couple of meetings about if the city's revising its subdivision ordinance for preliminary consent, how would this differ? How would that flow chart differ? What's we wanted to cite what the purposes are to hopefully clear it up with all the other information we're getting. So the major parts of this, again, this is in 17019. So it only applies to major subdivisions at this, for this section of it. If we wanted to include something similar for site plans, we'd have to include that in that other section. But this one applies to major subdivisions, and the purposes are first and foremost to provide information to the applicant. And then really importantly is to inform and engage the public. And the third part of the purpose is to obtain design input from agencies or staff. Then it goes on and talks a little bit more about some of the activities and how the review is done, but it also calls out that it's not used to determine final plan compliance. So the only compliance really to look at in preliminary is has the applicant met the code for submitting a preliminary review application? The rest of it is to really inform the applicant, to talk about what will be required for compliance, but that comes in final plan review. And then it talks about opportunities to ensure the applicant's aware of review criteria and to discuss and provide recommendations to help. So it's really to help refine the preliminary, or to refine the subdivision design, and then provide recommendations.
How is it,
froze
in
up.
terms of informing the public? I mean, these aren't public meetings necessarily, are they?
So major subdivisions always require a public hearing.
Yes, but is the, when we said there was a preliminary meeting, I thought there was a requirement for a meeting before the public meeting. No?
Well,
mean-
so go ahead.
I guess I'm just questioning whether I'm trying to think of, is there a way we can ensure we avoid having a big public meeting where someone comes without having provided the right the proper information for the public to review or see? And
So again, that's where, so you start with this pre-application meeting. So they're going to meet with staff, and then they're going to submit their application. Staff's going to review it. So I'm going to review it. Charlie's going to review it. We're going to go try and get comments from other agencies.
okay,
And then we're going to turn that into a report. And then when it goes to a public hearing before commission, then you guys have all that information.
okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes,
that
sorry, I
work?
was getting confused that we're talking about
That's okay.
the review meeting and not the pre-application meeting. Okay.
Yeah. And so think of your preliminary review meeting as your public hearing now.
Yeah.
Instead of 2 meetings, you guys discuss it and then schedule a public hearing.
Mhm.
I think it would just be cleaner. It's like you just schedule a public hearing and then all your conversation happens during the public hearing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What do you guys think about that?
Yeah.
I like the idea. I guess my only qualification would be, I don't see anything in here that requires all of this information to be publicly accessible before the meeting.
So we can get to that.
Okay.
Because
Code.
yeah, the code, yeah, I mean, there's going to be like process requirements
Mhm.
and public notice requirements. So we're just kind of like still in the big picture and haven't gotten down to the nuts and bolts yet.
Janelle, just a personal, I'm missing the word input. It's like you want to provide recommendations and input to the applicant. I don't know if it could, if
Right.
it's,
And remember, this is just a
Of course.
purpose statement. This is just, big picture. This is what the
it.
intent is. So we can
Scoping
add
it.
that. And then, because I know we lost
Well, Tom.
Tom.
Back now, hopefully.
Okay,
I don't-
good. Yay.
Was it just me?
Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
it happens. So yeah, we were just kind of having a big discussion that like this is just like the preliminary plan, just the purpose, kind of like the purpose statement. And then I think if we go,
And sorry, before we go on though, it's not simply to inform the public, it is to also receive comments from the public.
yes,
Because I think of if we say inform, to me, it wouldn't require us to allow anyone from the public even to be heard or to speak. I mean,
I think that's a fair point,
Yeah.
because so meetings are just that, and we
Yeah.
really do want to promote, we're really stressed that it's about receiving comment.
yeah, and I think if we get like this is the preliminary review, and then what's required in the preliminary review, one is a public hearing, so we do receive public comment. So yeah, we can add that. Because I mean, I'm not trying to get rid of public hearings. No,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
important. Need to hear from the public. Just trying to streamline the process.
Yeah.
Was there a purpose statement before for chapter 170?
There's a purpose statement in, I think it's 172, that's for the whole ordinance.
Right, but not one, okay. And I think that kind of goes along with our previous discussion in the other meeting about changing from preliminary consent to preliminary review.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and as we've talked and we're going to get into is those 20 some odd criteria are going to end up in like each section's kind of like purpose statements or into a standard or guideline, because that's kind of where they more fit. So they all are important, but they fit somewhere else. And I think if we kind of like, I'll let Tom get into review and standards and guidelines, because I
Okay.
think that's where it's going to come out.
All right, let's roll then.
Okay. So we're going to dive into that now. And what I'm doing is I'm skimming through the ordinance, and we're going to come back and look at the ordinance. The other material I sent shows more ordinance language, but I want to talk to you about the format and where it's placed and how they relate together before we dive into the details. Because I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page, and if you have thoughts on it, I can understand where you want us to go with it. So I'm just going to talk conceptually about design standards and guidelines, and we talked quite a bit at the last meeting about it. What we're trying to do, they're somewhat scattered around the subdivision ordinance and zoning as well. We can't pull all the ones out of zoning into subdivision, but we could try to consolidate all the ones that are in the subdivision ordinance into one section. So that's what one of the attempts is to bring them into Article 4, where the design standards for major subdivisions are. We may need to look at it if we're looking at site plan review, but I've thought about this a little bit. In Lewis site plan review, a lot of that's already done by the joint committee, and their ordinance has a lot of design standards in it. So we may need to look at that, how the two may bridge. But what I see these applying to primarily is subdivisions, which means residential homes, attached and detached, and multifamily in most cases. And then site plans are all the non-residential. But if you think about it for now, Article 4 is applying primarily to major subdivisions. Within that section, that's where most of them are at. As we talked about last time, we're going to group them in categories, and they're somewhat already grouped in categories. We looked at some formats of them and titling them a little bit differently, but for now, this is the grouping of them. So there's utilities, streets, site design, environmental conditions, and stormwater management and drainage. The other thing to say about these is as we're reviewing them, and I have a couple samples I've done, it'll take quite a while to build them all. But what I wanted to do was go through a couple so you get an idea of where we're headed as a team. And the first thing to say is, where do we come up with these? So one thing we try to look at is, what's the comprehensive plan say about these topics? Or other adopted policies like the Historic Lewis Scenic Byway or the Quinn Report or something else the city's worked on. We try to say if there's any strategies or policies in those to bring those into these. So I don't want to get too much into the details on here because I'm going to back out of this in a minute, but here's the format that we're using currently or proposed to use in Article 4. So each of those categories would have standards underneath of them. So this one here is that you're looking at is site design, and then under that is site suitability. So there's an intent statement here. The intent is the proposed land use and its design can occur without increasing danger to health or peril from fire, flood, or other hazards. The proposed land use and design also addresses long-term sustainability needs, environmental, economic, or social, to ensure it can occur without increasing hazards, supports community needs, and avoids significant long-term costs or maintenance demands. So that intent, some of it came from one of the purpose statements back in 170-19E about increasing danger to health or peril from fire. And then other ones, some of the considerations you were looking at in there already is the financing of the subdivision and its financial impacts. So those things are kind of merged into this intent statement. The intent statement doesn't mean much on its own. It's something, terms are vague, or there'd be different interpretations, but it's followed by a list of standards and guidelines. And I only put one standard here and one guideline. In the other information that I put together, there's several under each of these. So the standards, and if you recall our earlier discussion, these are mandatory. You usually see the qualifier shall be done or must be done. So in this one, the preliminary design shall identify existing site conditions such as natural grade, wetlands, floodplain, tree clusters, hedgerows, buffers, water protection areas, scenic views, historic or cultural resources on the site and immediately adjacent. Lot layout and building placement shall be designed to minimize impacts to these existing conditions. That's only one standard. There's a few more probably with this one. And then guideline, and again, I'm just talking format for right now. A guideline goes with it. It doesn't say shall, it says should. The only mandatory thing with the guideline is the applicant has to address it. Whether or not they meet the exact specifications, that'll be decided and discussed. But we want to at least promote the idea with them that they should be looking at this and hopefully refine the design. And each of these design criteria has a set of standards that must be met and guidelines that should be addressed, if that makes sense. This guideline talks about the building and site layout should be compatible with existing topography and vegetation. Trees should be existing trees should be protected, particularly old growth. And again, that one is in the considerations or somewhere in there. It's not something we created. It's something that's in there, but we're bringing them together in a way that we hope makes better sense from an organizational standpoint.
I think another good, can I just jump in real quick, Tom?
Sure.
So like under site design, I think we could also like for an example that's already in the code is lighting and signage requirements for a subdivision. We have what's required. It's like they should be a consistent style. So we're going to keep all of our requirements and then they end up in our standards. And then one of the encouraged, which would be a guideline, is energy efficient streets, as well as signage lighting is encouraged. So that could be a guideline. So it's like we're just taking current code and kind of moving it into different functionality. And I think we also want to add different things to code requirements and guidelines. Does that help with another example of like just existing code?
Yes.
Think
One
so.
other thing I wanted to call out is that in terms of format, the intent statement, those are going to be in Article 4 with each of these, but they are also going to be the basis for much of the considerations the Planning Commission's looking at in preliminary review. Again, they're not to be looking at it for compliance with that. They're really, I think, as you get through a subdivision, you're going to be looking at what are the main topics that should be considered as part of the review. And these intent statements are opening up the general topics. You're not going to be looking at the details, but you can be making the applicant aware, and Janelle will certainly, and Charlie will certainly, that when they bring back for final plan, that these intent statements need to be backed up by requirements or work that needs to be done. But in preliminary review, the intent statement is there only to make them aware of the types of conditions they should be looking at and trying to address as part of their final plan when they do it. So we're using these to tie that back into the standards. Go ahead, Janelle.
Yeah, I also think like a good example is like, I'm gonna just keep using my lighting example, is they're showing the streetlights for the subdivision, but for the preliminaries, it's like, okay, they are providing streetlights, but by the time that they get the final, they might be showing the the lighting plan that shows that they're not that the lighting's not going off into another site. So at the time of preliminary, it's like, yep, we've got streetlights. We know they're going to be downward screened, but at the final, then they have that plan that says verifying that when based on showing what the foot candles are and that they aren't going off of the site. So it's like preliminary, it's like, yep, we're meeting the code requirement, we're showing it. And then the final detail comes at final. If that makes sense.
Yeah, because it was starting to dawn on me, but I might be wrong, that the guidelines were kind of like the recommendations that Planning Commission has been putting together, but that's during the final review phase now.
Yeah, and they can do that like
but-
earlier, or they can add like if it's encouraged. I think, if it's a guideline, but for a certain project they really want it, they can make that a condition of approval and send that recommendation to mayor and council. So even though if it's a guideline, maybe it really makes sense for a certain development, and then the commission can make a recommendation that's like, okay, we recommend approval of X, Y, and Z, but we also have the following conditions instead of that. And it's like that guideline then becomes a code requirement. And then it's up to mayor and council to go, do we really want that guideline as a code requirement or not? Which I mean currently happens now, but I think that's a good way, like thinking of sometimes the guidelines can be conditions that you can place on it if they're more specific, like the lighting example.
Do you think that there would be recommendations that come up on any particular subdivision review during the final review process that then the city would then consider as, to add in under guidelines for any one of these lighting, site design? Hey, that's a really good idea, but we don't have it in there right now. Maybe we should add it in. I feel like the guidelines part of it could be a living, growing thing as the more experience we have with more developments.
Right. And I always think, and just places I've worked in, is it might not be in code, but it's like, hey, I want you to build this. Or it's
Yeah.
like, you're going to build, like based on the number of units, you need to put in like 3 multi-purpose courts and a clubhouse of a certain size. So you're meeting some requirements, or it's like, hey, I know we require a 20-foot buffer, but I know that use we want to condition that you put in a 30-foot landscape buffer. So I think you can always build on code requirements and condition them. And then as conditions, especially depending on what you hear from the public, you know, so
Yeah,
that
and
can always tweak that.
I think to your point, Charlie, that the way some communities handle this is the standards are definitely in the subdivision ordinance. They're coded into it and linked into it. Some of them include the guidelines in the subdivision ordinance as well, but many of them pull them out into a supplemental manual that talks about the development process in the community. And the guidelines are in there with a lot more visuals and suggestions and options that they can consider to satisfy requirements. And it makes it easier to explain it to someone and to provide them with options, which isn't always easy to do in a code framework. It also makes it easier to update it. It still should be something that city council adopts, but not by ordinance. It's a tool that they would use, and they've done it with like the 5G, the telecommunications design guide too. So it's there for reference. It's easier to change it when it's in there. You don't need, it's not a zoning update or a subdivision update, ordinance update. So it's easier to handle things and explain design things a little bit better in a manual like that. So that's probably something we should consider, whether or not we list them all out as being in the code, or put them in there. I think you can have your cake and eat it too, is have them in there, but for additional consideration, have another document that gives examples or illustrations of how to do it.
Yeah, because currently we have the requirements and then we have encouraged in the code. And I mean, I think some of that encouraged honestly just should be options or requirements in the code. And I think we've got other best management practices for planning that we can put into guidelines with a lot of examples that Tom's been talking about, that then you can just take that guideline and make that a condition of approval. Which I think gives you guys more flexibility and ability to review a plan.
When you say that it is easier to update it if it's guidelines in a separate document, what would be different about the process for updating it? Because it still would be city council that would have to vote to update that, wouldn't it?
Yes, but it wouldn't require 2 public hearings.
Okay.
It wouldn't require public hearing before planning commission. You guys can just like, if coming from you guys can just like, hey, we want to add this guideline and make that recommendation. And then council can just say yes or no.
Okay.
There's no notice requirements. Again, we post everything and we put everything on the website. So public, I know there's a few listening, it just, it doesn't have to go through the more detailed process. It could just be like, pops up on an agenda. We like that idea. Let's make that recommendation and you can move forward.
And you may have several of them at one time that on an annual basis, you put them in there and update them, the separate design manual that goes along with it.
So we would recommend if it's a guideline, then it would go to mayor and city council for discussion, and then they could make the decision at that meeting, correct? Whether to solidify or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, to amend the guidelines. Yep.
Okay.
And so when we're talking about making some changes here to the standards and to guidelines, Even for, I'm thinking of things like, of course, open space is on my, is on my mind. Uh, you know, especially when we're drafting something that's new, and we, as we get some experience with it, having it not in the code, but as a guideline in a separate document would make it easier to adjust that to achieve the goals that were intended.
Yeah, as long as the underlying, like, I'm going to use my lighting, as long as we're like, hey, we've got lighting in the code, and we've got some standards, but here are some options we also as guidelines, then you can change those. What you don't want to start doing is, if it doesn't tie back to the standards, like to the streets or stormwater management or something,
Mhm.
in the guidelines, as long as it ties back to one of those
Yeah.
categories somehow.
Okay.
And I just want to make sure that the public would have a chance if we're, saying, all right, we're going to take this guideline and make it a requirement. I don't want to, take the process too much out of the public's hands as well. So when it goes up to mayor and city council, as long, if they're having a discussion about if there's still ability for public input at that point, or.
Well, if it goes from a guideline to a requirement, then it would need to be in the code, and it would need a public hearing to go through that process, and
Okay.
the public would be involved in the review of the public hearing. But I do think the council has to act on the guidelines in a public meeting as well. So they're both going
Absolutely.
to have public opportunity for public to be aware of it.
That's
and to
just,
review
that
it.
was the only thing I wanted to make sure was clear on
Yeah.
that side of things. So I don't want to get in a position where, oh, we think this is a great idea. All right, let's do it.
Now,
Yeah.
anytime you
Get
make
to
something
it
a
in with the
requirement,
original,
it
yeah.
goes through the ordinance process, which is the much more stringent. If it's like, hey, maybe we should also, make this a guideline, like encourage this and encourage that. It's like,
Mhm.
hey, maybe for lighting, we should encourage solar lighting, but not make it a requirement.
Gotcha.
That you don't need a public hearing for,
Gotcha.
unless you were going to
Okay.
make it a code requirement.
Okay. All right.
Hey, Janelle, I just want to throw it out there. One of the little quandaries I've always had is, as your engineer, I review very well against the standards, but I have difficulty making any comment regarding guidelines because they're subjective in nature, and I don't feel like it's my place to say, you need more trees, or you need a different kind of lighting pattern, or, well, lighting pattern I can probably do, but a different style of light or something. So I want to throw that out there because, once planning commission reacts and requires recommendations and conditions, then it's easy for me to follow up on those, but I don't tend to make those sort of subjective comments in my initial review.
Yeah, I think, but I have a little bit more leeway because as the planner, I look a little bit more big picture, and sometimes I
Yeah.
do make a recommendation. And then I think, I think a lot of the conditions regarding the guidelines are going to come from the planning commission. And then it's going to be finally up to mayor and council to go, okay, well, the planning commission made a recommendation with, these 6 conditions. Do we want to adopt them or not? And once it gets adopted by mayor and council saying, yep, these are the things you need to do before you go get final, then when the plan comes back for us to review, we know they
Yeah.
have to meet that.
Yeah.
But because I think a lot of your engineering won't have a lot of guidelines, Charlie. I think you guys are your section is gonna be much more standard based,
Yeah.
but like lighting and open space and maybe some design standards have a little bit more flexibility and guidelines in them.
I
And
know
I
think
when
another- Go ahead, Charlie.
when I designed Second Street 20 years ago, I had recommended a different kind of brick paver, and I got shot down real quick. So I learned my lesson then to kind of stay out of that sort of thing.
I was going to mention too that as you look at some of the guidelines, a lot of those are going to be new because your ordinance was a lot of standards, and it's hard to include something in an ordinance if it can't be a standard. For instance, putting porches on the front of a house to make them more inviting to the streetscape. That's not typically something you can require by zoning, but it is something you can encourage and talk about with an applicant. And a lot of times applicants will, you're helping them make decisions. So it's not a requirement for things like that, but it's definitely useful in the right applications. And I think it allows the planning commission to really understand all the things that they're interested in doing. And some of them can be required and some of them can be recommendations that I think are useful to have during your review sessions, to break them out that way.
Agreed.
So Janelle, that was the overview. I sent out a lot of the details. The only thing that I'm interested in from the other things in terms of overview is how we use those intent statements back in 170-19E. I included in the document the ones that had been completed, and we just reviewed one of them, but there's other ones there. So I'm interested, and I know you haven't had much time to look at them all, but I'm interested in the ones that are completed, how that will fit into your process.
So I'm going to take us even a step back. Do you like this process about breaking things down into categories a little bit more, coming up with the intent purpose statement, and then putting in standards and then guidelines?
Are you asking me or are you
Who
talking?
are you asking? Yeah.
You, Joe, Joe, Nancy, and John, because you guys are the 3 commission members, and okay, Joe's getting the thumbs up. Melanie, sorry, Nancy, I don't know why. I've also been working with a melody today, so it's like my brain's just stuck. So I apologize, Nancy.
2 gray-haired women, what can we say?
Apologize.
It's okay.
So if you guys like that, I think what we want to do is we can even kind of discuss this a little bit at commission on Wednesday. But I think what Tom and I and Charlie really want to get started on is like now bringing the code back into this.
So transferring the code into this format of
Yes.
design standard, guideline, intent. I like it. I think it makes sense. I think it makes things clearer for the applicant, really. And actually looks a little easier for me to understand, to tell you the truth. I think versus the current situation, I feel like it's a little more user friendly. I think it's it seems like it's a pretty big task to take what we already have and put it into this format. If you guys are ready to get that done, then I think it'd be great.
Yeah, and I think we'll also work on like a checklist for what code requirements are needed at preliminary and the code requirements needed at final, so people understand. So we'll have like 2 lists. Like these are all our broken down sections, like our environmental, our site design, our utilities, etc., and have all those standards. Then we can have like a list of like, this is what's required in preliminary, this is what's required in final. And I actually even took Tom's list and I was like, well, we'll just do an entire section that says this is what the public notice requirements are, because the public notice requirements are kind of different and it's kind of choppy. So I'm just going to I think we'll just do a section that just says, hey, this is what your public notice requirement is. So it's simple and I think easier for everybody to understand.
I think whatever we can do to make it more user friendly for people who are applying, so the process is clear, is useful. But my one question, and I'm still newer to this committee than newer to the commission than others. If something is obviously, if something is a requirement, it's required. It has to happen, unless we recommend that City Council give a waiver or pass on it. For something that's a guideline, when members of Planning Commission are voting on a subdivision, if they believe that the plan doesn't respect or reflect guidelines, is that a valid reason to vote against something?
I think it would
I-
be it would be difficult to vote against something that doesn't meet a guideline because it's not a code requirement.
Okay,
But what you
It's not-
can do is say, like, you want that guideline in the plan, go, I vote to recommend approval of this application with this condition which is guideline number 3 or whatever. So,
Uh-huh.
and as long as you get 5 votes to go with you, then you can make that guideline a requirement of a specific plan.
okay, okay.
Does that make sense?
That
And-
makes sense, but I think it's important to the applicants understand that. Because I
Oh,
think it
yes.
can be very frustrating for applicants who think they have, kind of ticked all of the boxes in terms of requirements to kind of go through a process where they suddenly find that there are other conditions that can be placed on them. So
Yeah, and I think
it just means, I think when people are looking at the guidelines, they will look at them more closely than they might otherwise if they weren't aware of that.
strongly encourage people,
Yeah.
strongly encourage the guidelines, take the
Mhm.
guidelines seriously. And again, you guys would make the recommendation to council. Council can, based on what they hear, like, well, we don't really like that guideline, but maybe we'll like another guideline.
Right.
So, but yeah, you have the ability to take guidelines and make them conditions of a recommendation.
Okay.
Yeah, my experience with developers been pretty good actually, in terms of, I don't know, Joe, Nancy, John, you guys might know better, Janelle, but I feel like, 75, 80% of the time, they just incorporate the conditions and recommendations pretty well. And, they don't put much of a fight up. Sometimes they do, but a lot of times they just do it because it's easier to do it than, especially if it's not a real costly one, than to fight it.
And I think you'll find that some of those guidelines are things that the subdividing applicants not looking at that point. They're looking at splitting lots off and they have a building footprint, but they don't necessarily think about where the windows openings are and the doors, and they're more amenable to addressing that at that point because they're not even at that point yet in a lot of cases. They're providing to you illustrations or images, but that's not necessarily, and I think they'll say it's not the final design, but you can stress the need for having dormers on things or facing a street in a certain way, that I think if you say it that early in the process, there's less resistance to doing it later on. So there's standards there. They have to be met. The guidelines are there to address and try to make them as applicable as possible. It's better to have them there as recommendations or guidelines than not having them there at all, in my experience.
Yeah, and it's not so much the developers, it's their lawyers too that are
Yeah,
better
that's true.
all these.
Well,
So
and sometimes it's
on a parallel track is the developers and the lawyers.
and sometimes it's the builder. It's like what, building, because they have their prototypes of what they sell. So it's like, making sure we get, what makes sense for Lewis.
Yeah.
Hey, Janelle, I don't know, it's definitely not the right time to bring it up, but that whole thing about city council and, looking at a project, and I didn't even know this word existed, remanded things.
Yeah, we're not
And
talking
then-
about that right now.
Yeah, okay, I just feel like, we need to make sure they understand that items that are identified for remanding don't include everything that needs to be completed.
Yeah, and I think this will clean up all of our processes that is kind of murky right now.
Okay,
So I think this process just makes things cleaner and a little bit easier to understand and understand, it's like, if you want additional information, you can definitely ask for it, but don't forget, like, at some point, requirements come at final, or, but I think if it's on a state maintained road and they're saying TIS, I think the planning commission should see the results before they make a recommendation. because there are certain things you should make a recommendation. But I think everybody needs to take a step back, because you're going to start seeing things at a more preliminary, less designed phase, because that's where you're doing is looking at a preliminary plan. And I think Tom and I already discussed, what does substantial improvement mean? That it needs to go back to somebody for review if for a substantial improvement. And I've worked at places where if, like it was a site plan and it just increased in square footage, it was an automatic substantial change. So it went back. If it decreased in square footage, nobody was that wasn't. But if it, like, we had a project, it increased by 200 square feet, like you got to go back through the planning commission. And I think in other places it was like you had your road layout changed, so it wasn't what they saw it the first time. So then that's a substantial change. But like if stormwater management ponds shift a little bit or lots shift a little bit, that happens when you're going through your design process.
Gotcha.
And that can change from preliminary to final. So I just want everybody to think, what you guys will be seeing is not going to be the final plan. Things will tweak a little bit, but putting something in there to discuss substantial change.
Yeah, I still owe you and Tom my response to that, like things I think that would require to go back to, go back to step one, I guess. I'll email those to you. I've got those together now.
Perfect.
Cool. I look forward to taking that up soon. So what do we have next? We got design standards, intent statement.
Janelle, how would you like to use the rest of the time? I have enough to work on things. I can, I'll leave that up to you. I don't know what else you wanted to cover in the meeting.
Well, I just wanted to make sure everybody was comfortable, because then we can just start going back and taking the code requirements and putting them into the new sections. So and again, I think we also need to make sure we get that feedback on Wednesday, because you guys are good with it, but we've got several other people who, want to make sure that they're okay with the process and the design. So I think, Tom, I can get back to you end of this week, Thursday. Well, actually we have Friday off. So Thursday or Monday of next week.
Mhm.
And then we can just start going, like, let's take a section by section kind of approach to it.
Okay.
So we can just, and Charlie, I'm giving you homework that if the commission likes this, then you're in charge of streets. And I'm guessing you're going to want to put some design standards for one-way streets in the code for the guideline for your standards, and then what your guidelines are, and then utilities. Because I'm not touching water, sewer, Charlie. That's
No, I saw that 2 weeks ago, I think, and I wasn't sure what I needed to do. But now that we've had this discussion and I see the framework that we're trying to develop, that I have some direction to get that ready.
okay. Perfect.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm not worried about numbering. I'm just worried about like getting our intent purpose statements and then our standards and then guidelines, because then we can just put it all into one big ordinance and to take that from there.
And Charlie, as I said in my email, I was going through the comp plan and looking for policy statements on some of these things, and there was a few on streets and circulation. I didn't see any on stormwater or not in terms of policies for beyond working in conjunction with BPW and all. But for streets, there was quite a bit about context sensitive design and other things. So I included those in the intent statements for those, but it's definitely, I'll work with you to refine things.
Okay, definitely. And, I can get quite poetic about sewers and water pipes.
Oh, good.
I'll
Look
work on that
forward to
part of it.
And
Looking forward to it.
John, Joe, and Nancy, if you guys have any guidelines or standards that, it's like, or something that's in the code that you want to like change or highlight, please let us know as we're going through this. So, and I know I've got some definitions I need to get out for open space, which I'm hoping will be good.
Yeah. Janelle, the one thing under guidelines, the one little paragraph you had talked about saving existing trees or whatever, but I don't know if it's the right place to add about removal of invasive species, might be at the same time. It's all nice to save a good ancient tree, but if it's an invasive blue spruce or something, something that's totally out of the picture,
Yeah.
it'd be okay to knock it down. So
Can-
that's my 2 cents.
No, that's a good one. I like
Yeah,
that one.
invasive species.
Yes. Yeah, I think we can like encourage native, plantings or non-native, non-invasive plantings as something to be required for like buffers, but what we don't want is invasive species showing up.
Right.
We've got that in the buffer zone ordinance, actually.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Good.
I think so.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, the
it's-
wetlands buffer.
Oh, wait, yeah, I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar.
The non-native, non-invasive.
Great, that's how we said it. Yeah.
Yes. So, yeah, we can definitely take a look at that. Anything else you guys have suggestions on, ideas?
Not at the present, no.
Okay.
I'm good.
Do you think, I don't want to turn this around in 2 weeks because I think we've got a lot of work to do.
This is a big, this
Yeah.
is big.
This is
overhaul.
big.
Yeah, this is a big overhaul.
And I think that's like July 4th week right around then too. Is 2 weeks. So that
That's not a good week to be doing.
no.
I'll be away.
Mhm.
So do you guys want to get back together the week of July 11th, 12th, or the 18th, 19th, which gives us a good month to get stuff, kind of tweaked? Which one works better for you guys?
The week of July 12th would be good for me.
Okay.
I'm just checking.
No worries.
Week of July 12th is good for me.
Okay.
Yeah, week of July 12th is good for me as well. If that give you guys enough time to
Mhm.
restructure this.
Yeah.
I
I mean,
think,
because there is a public hearing on July 13th, I'd prefer not to have it on July 13th. Just,
okay. 15th. Oh. We could do Thursday the 15th in the afternoon. We can do Friday the 16th in the morning.
Can't do Friday.
Okay.
I could do Thursday or I could do Thursday.
Thursday's good for me.
I can do Thursday.
Yep,
3 o'clock.
sounds good.
I could do earlier during the day as well now. After June 21st, I'm done with the school, so I'm no longer
Freedom.
held to that schedule. So I could do, if you guys wanted to meet earlier in the day, I'm game. It's up to you guys. 3 o'clock works for me still, but
Yeah, the earliest we could do is 1 o'clock because there's morning meetings.
okay.
But you guys just tell me what works for you guys.
You guys want to do earlier at 1?
Any of those times are good for me.
One is
So
good.
Okay.
1 p.m.
That works.
Okay. I'll get that scheduled, and then we might not be completely done, but I think we'll have a good chunk done, so we can make sure we're on the right path and it's looking good. And again, if you guys have any, like, you're looking over the standards or come up with some guidelines, please let us know, and we can make those changes and include them into the draft.
Okay, good.
Ew.
Okay. And we do have 2 members of the public. Do you want to hear if they have any questions or comments?
Sure.
I think we have Mr. Terrell. I think Brent. Yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't think we were taking.
we
public
can,
comment. Okay.
just
Well,
so, if
Mr. Terrell, you got anything to say, or would you like to provide any input?
and if you could use the Q&A chat, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
Type it in.
Yep, if you just want to type, if you've got anything. If not, that's perfectly fine. And we'll be kind of given an overview on Wednesday night to the commission, because I want to make sure we get through them before we start
Yeah.
overhauling the subdivision code.
Well, it looks like we're good. So I say we adjourn, and thank you all very much for your time and attention to this matter. I really appreciate it. You guys have been a great team to work with.
Okay.
Thank you, John.
Thank
too.
you.
All right, everybody have a good afternoon.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Janelle, can you stay on for just 1 minute with me?
Yep.
Thanks.
George is still on. Oop, let me hit stop recording.